freighter smelled like old plastic and recycled air. And David stopped noticing both about 6 months ago. You stop noticing things out here. You stop noticing a lot of things. He was a day and a half past the Karath exclusion zone when the warning blinked on. Soft amber against the dim instrument glow. The kind of alert his ship's system flagged as low priority. The kind he usually dismissed without reading. He almost did. His hand was already moving toward the confirm and close toggle when something stopped him. Some animal instinct, something below language that lives at the bottom of the spine, pulled his hand back and read the full message. Foreign memory detected. Cortical review recommended. David sat for a long time with the amber light pulsing on his face. He was 43 years old, a freight hauler, working the rim runs, licensed and unremarkable. He had a small apartment on Calais Station that he visited twice a year, had a sister back on Earth, who sent him voice messages he listened to while eating. He had a job, and a ship, and the particular kind of loneliness that grows in people who choose deep space for long enough that the choice starts choosing them. He was in every conceivable way an ordinary man. He initiated the cortical review anyway. What came back wasn't a memory, it was a message. It arrived the way real memories never do, too organized, too sequential, the images moving in a direction rather than sprawling in every direction at once. Someone had buried it inside him like a letter inside a sealed room, and the letter said, "When you are old enough, when you are out here, when you are alone and you receive this, find me." The face in the memory wasn't human. The Veth had been surveilling human space, human before humanity found out, and they had been doing it calmly, with the particular patience of a species that had outlasted 3 other civilizations in this arm of the galaxy. They were not aggressive. Exactly. They were something more unsettling. They were thorough. They studied the way a pathologist studies. Clinically, with the understanding that the subject is not going to object. When humanity found out, the finding out happened the way most catastrophic discoveries happen. Not through military intelligence or diplomatic backchannels, but through accident, through one freighter pilot on a routine run who intercepted a compressed signal burst that his system shouldn't have been able to decode but did, because the Veth encryption schema was based on a harmonic sequence that bore an improbable resemblance to a folk song the pilot's grandmother had taught him. And so the decryption happened in a completely wrong part of his brain, and what came out the other side was comprehensible. Pilot's name was not David. David came later. But the thing that started with that pilot, the understanding, the knowing, it moved through human space like a tide. And David, floating in his freighter above the amber light of the rim, was not yet part of that understanding. He would be. The message in his head said, "They are watching you. They have always been watching. Something they want that they cannot simply take. Because taking it would destroy the thing they want. They need a willing participant. They have been waiting, patiently, for 11 years, for the right one to find." The message said, "I put this here when you were 6 years old. I am sorry. I thought it might save you. I thought it might save us." The message said, "Find me at the following coordinates." And the coordinates were 22 days off David's current route, and his cargo manifest would not wait 22 days. And David sat there in the amber pulsing dark of his ship and thought about the kind of man he was. He'd always thought he was the kind of man who would just keep going, keep the run, file the manifest, let the Admiralty handle whatever was coming. He had a sister who sent him voice messages. He had an apartment. He was not a soldier or a diplomat or a man of consequence. He was just David. He typed the new coordinates into the nav system and felt the ship angle slowly around. And then he went and made coffee and stood at the small porthole and watched the stars slide sideways as the freighter changed course. And he thought, there it is then. The signal had originated from a region the charts marked as uninhabited, which was the kind of lie that charts tell when no one has bothered to check. The place had a name in the Veth cartographic record. 3 subsonic clicks that translated loosely as the area where we keep the ones we are still deciding about. But David didn't know that yet. All he knew was that, after 22 days of travel, eating packaged food and sleeping badly and listening to his sister's voice messages on repeat, The coordinates delivered him to a small moon that had no business being as temperate as it was, circling a gas giant in a system with a designation but no proper name. And on that moon there was a structure. It was not a Veth structure. He could tell that immediately. The architecture was all wrong for Veth, too bilateral, too gridded, too human in its logic. But it wasn't human-built either, not officially. It occupied a middle territory, the way language sometimes does, when two people are trying very hard to speak across an enormous gap. He landed in a clearing that appeared to have been deliberately maintained for that purpose. The vegetation cut back in a perfect oval, and he sat in his ship for 40 minutes before he got out, because 40 minutes was how long it took him to stop shaking. The structure's door opened before he reached it. Inside, a single room, walls covered in what looked like printed text in at least a dozen languages, screens showing data feeds that David couldn't parse, and in the center of the room, a figure seated at a console that was clearly too big for her, because she had built it for a version of herself that was larger than the version currently sitting in it. Was human. Mostly. The eyes were wrong. Too flat in the iris, with a quality like still water. And when she turned to look at him, the movement was too smooth. The way movement is when something other than muscle is doing the work. "You came," she said, and her voice was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep deprivation. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," David said. This was true. "I know. I've watched you almost not do things for a long time." He didn't know what to say to that. He looked at the walls, at the text. "How long have you been here?" "It depends on which version of here you mean," she said. "I've been in this room for 8 months. I've been in some version of this conversation for considerably longer." She paused. "My name is Mira. It was before. It's what I prefer. What I am is more complicated. You're the one who put that memory in my head. When you were 6, you were at a market with your mother. You were looking at a toy, a little ship, plastic, badly painted red. You wanted it very much." She said this softly, not as an accusation. "I sat down next to you for about 90 seconds while your mother was at another stall. You don't remember it because I made sure you wouldn't." "Not yet. I'm sorry for that." David thought about this. "Why, me?" "Because you're the kind of man who changes course." She looked at him steadily. "Most people, when they get an alert like the one you received, dismiss it. The statistical majority dismiss it within 4 seconds. You almost did. But you read the whole message. That matters." "Matters for what?" "For what comes next," Mira said, and turned back to her console and began to explain. The Veth had a word. It required 4 vocal chambers to pronounce correctly, and humans had 2, so the close maximum was something like the property of being readable. And for 11 years, they had been assessing human space for this property. Reading humanity the way you would read a book you were considering acquiring, turning the pages slowly, taking notes. What they found, Mira explained, was complicated. Humans were disorganized, emotionally volatile, geographically scattered, technologically inconsistent, and prone to what the Veth categorized as catastrophic self-interruption. The tendency to build something impressive and then destroy it, or destroy themselves, or both, at irregular intervals. They were, by almost every metric the Veth applied, exactly the kind of species that got folded into the archive, documented, preserved, and set aside. But there was a problem. "They can't read us," Mira said. "That's the thing." After 11 years of observation, their models still don't accurately predict human behavior. The error rate is, she brought up a number on a screen. This, which for a Vith model is catastrophic. They don't fail at modeling. Modeling is what they do. Is, in a very real sense, the only thing they do. Why can't they model us? Chaos theory partly. Genetic diversity, emotional variability, cultural recursion. We have too many variables and too much noise. There's something else. She paused, and for the first time looked uncertain. "We remember differently. Our memory architecture doesn't optimize. It doesn't prune cleanly. Keep things that have no informational value. Emotional residue, sensory echoes, associations. The Veth call this a deficiency. Their own memory systems are almost surgical in comparison. They remember precisely what is useful. Everything else is discarded." David thought about the toy ship at the market. Badly painted red. He couldn't have told you his bank account number from when he was 6. but he could still feel the weight of that ship in his hands. He could feel how badly he'd wanted it. They think our irrationality is a weakness, Mira said. They've been waiting for us to grow out of it, to optimize, to become more legible, and we haven't, and we haven't. Something moved in her flat water eyes, but they've run out of patience. The council convenes in 47 days. After that, the decision gets made. They have a term for the process. It translates roughly as corrective integration, which is what they call it when they stop waiting. David stared at her. And you, what are you? Why do you know all this? Mira was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had a quality like paper that's been folded many times, still intact, but with all the folds showing. I was taken, 15 years ago, a survey team. There were 4 of us. She paused again. There is now 1 of me. The Veth are patient scientists, David. They do not cause suffering intentionally. They are not cruel. They are something almost worse. They are thorough. She touched the console with one hand. They gave me back eventually. What they gave back was mostly me. Mostly. She pulled up a diagram on the main screen, a web of nodes and connections that David slowly recognized as a network map. Relay stations. Communication hubs. The Veth signal infrastructure that lace through the rim, like roots through soil. The reason they can't model us, Mira said, is also the reason they're afraid of us. Not consciously. The Veth don't have unconscious fear. They have calculated risk assessment. But the result is the same. We are unpredictable. In 47 days, they are going to stop treating unpredictability as a research problem and start treating it as a security problem. And you want me to. I don't want you to fight them. You can't fight them. I want you to make them understand something. She turned to face him fully. There's a thing we have that they cannot model, cannot replicate, and, when they finally examine it properly, cannot dismiss. I've spent 8 months building the argument. I need someone to deliver it. Someone ordinary. Someone they haven't accounted for. I haul freight, David said. I know. That's exactly why. The thing about being ordinary is that it's a disguise that fits perfectly because it isn't a disguise at all. David spent 3 days on the moon going through Mira's work, the 8 months of analysis, the model comparisons, the record of every failed Veth prediction regarding human behavior. He was not a scientist. He had a freight license and a moderate aptitude for navigation and a habit of listening to his sister's voice messages until he could almost recite them. He was not qualified to evaluate what Mira had built. He understood it anyway, not because it was simple. It wasn't, but because it was at its core about a thing he knew without being able to name it. The thing at the bottom of the spine. The thing that made him read the full message. On the second night, he asked Mira what the Veth were like, and she told him. She told him for hours, in the careful way of someone who has organized a terrible experience into narrative in order to survive it. They were tall and bilateral and moved in groups of 3 as a default social unit, and they communicated in frequencies that overlapped with human hearing, but not in ways humans could decode without modification. They were, she said, genuinely curious about humanity, not maliciously, not with contempt. They studied humans the way you would study a problem you found genuinely interesting but couldn't solve. They've been in 12 other first contacts, Mira said. 11 of them resulted in integration. Just 1 resulted in what they call mutual recognition. Quality. What made that 1 different? She smiled, and it was the first real smile he'd seen from her. The other species figured out how to make the Veth laugh. David thought about this. Sighed. The gas giant was rising above the horizon, enormous and banded in copper and brown, and its light came through the structure's single window and lay across the floor like something solid. He thought about his sister's voice messages. He thought about a toy ship, badly painted red. "Show me," he said, "what you've built." The approach to the Veth primary hub required passage through 3 levels of quarantine screening that Mira had prepared documentation for, false identifications that described David as a xenological consultant for a survey firm that existed in the databases but not in reality. The Veth's security systems were not designed to catch humans pretending to be other humans because the Veth had not previously encountered humans who understood how to navigate Veth bureaucracy. This was, Mira noted, exactly the kind of thing their models had failed to anticipate. David piloted his freighter through the screening corridors, with his hands very steady and his mind doing the thing it did when he was nervous, which was to make a list of every stupid decision he had ever made and rank them by severity. And the current decision was winning by a considerable margin. The hub was not what he'd expected. He'd expected something fortress-like, something that announced its own power. He found was quieter, a structure of considerable size but restrained geometry, the Veth aesthetic being one of purposeful understatement, everything built to function and nothing built to intimidate, which was, in its own way, more intimidating than anything dramatic could have been. Turk. He was escorted to a consultation chamber by two Veth who moved with the fluid, careful grace of something that had never once in its life acted without consideration. They were taller than he'd imagined. They smelled of something mineral and faintly electric. They regarded him with the flat, attentive study of scientists at a new specimen, and David smiled at them and said good morning in the Veth phonetic approximation that Mira had spent 3 hours drilling into him, and both Veth stopped moving for approximately 2 seconds. He'd been told that 2 seconds was the Veth equivalent of a double take. The consultation chamber had no chairs. The Veth stood as a default, and did not typically consider whether their guests preferred otherwise. David stood, his back hurt. He thought about his apartment on Calais Station, and the chair in it that was shaped exactly right, worn down to his particular contours over years of use. He thought about how much he would like to be in that chair. The Veth Council liaison entered. She, the Veth, had gender loosely. The phoneme attached to this one carried a feminine marker. Moved to the center of the room and regarded David for a long moment, and David let her look. He was ordinary. He had a freight license and a sore back and a sister who sent him voice messages. He had a toy ship, badly painted red, living in his memory with no practical use whatsoever. He let all of that be visible, in the way a person who has nothing to hide lets things be visible, just by not hiding them. He began with Mira's data, the 11 years of observation, the modeling errors, the failure rate. He presented these, without editorial, without drama, in the careful sequential language that Mira had prepared. A translation that the Veth could receive without distortion. The liaison listened with complete stillness, which was how the Veth listened, and David spoke for 40 minutes. And at the end of the 40 minutes he stopped. The liaison said, in the Veth phonemic system that his suit's translator rendered imperfectly, "This we know. You have presented our own failure to us accurately, but you have not explained it." "No," David agreed. "I was getting to that." He told her about the market. He told it simply, the way you tell things that don't require embellishment, because they're already exactly themselves. He was 6 years old. His mother was buying vegetables. He saw a toy ship. Plastic, badly painted red. The paint job was the work of some human being who had done this particular job badly, who had probably been tired, who had probably been thinking of something else, and he had wanted it with a completeness that he now understood was available only to 6-year-olds. That particular wanting that has not yet learned to protect itself by being proportionate. He did not get the ship. His mother didn't have the money that week. He remembered the exact weight of the not getting it. Not as information, not as data, but as a physical sensation, something that lived in his chest. 37 years later, David said, "I still know exactly what that ship felt like. It was light. The plastic was smooth. The red paint was a little rough near the nose where they'd applied too much. I know this. I will always know this." He looked at the liaison. "Your models failed because you were looking for optimization. You expected us to prune, to clean up, to discard what had no function." He paused. "We don't. We keep everything. The pain, the longing, the half-finished things, the toys we never got, the faces of people we never saw again. We keep the voice messages from our sisters long after we could recite them. We carry the weight of every moment we almost did something differently." The liaison was very still. This was, he had come to understand, not neutrality. It was attention, the most complete attention the Veth could pay. "You think this is a defect," David said. "It isn't. It's why I'm here. A message in a woman and left her 15 years ago. And she spent 8 months building an argument. And she put a memory in a 6-year-old boy. And 37 years later, That man changed course because something at the bottom of his spine remembered how it felt to almost not read to the end. That is not irrational. That is the most rational thing we do. It is why we survive. He let that land. It is why, every time you integrate a civilization, you lose something you didn't know you needed. Silence. The gas giant, impossibly, was visible through a viewport set high in the chamber wall. He hadn't noticed it before. Its copper and brown light lying in a bar across the floor. He thought, I will always remember this room. The mineral smell, and that light on the floor, and the weight of saying the true thing. Your models fail, he said quietly. Because you're modeling a people who remember everything. You've been watching us for 11 years, making predictions based on what we should rationally do. We don't do what we should rationally do. We do what we remember we promised. We do what the 6-year-old in us couldn't let go of. You can't model that. You'll never be able to model that. He paused. And that should tell you something. Not about our weakness. About yours. He did not expect it to work. This, Mira would later tell him, was also part of why it worked. The Death Council did not render decisions quickly. The 47 days passed and then more days passed, and David returned to his freight run and filed his overdue manifest and received a fine for late delivery that he paid without complaint and listened to his sister's voice messages and waited. The reply came 6 weeks later in a format that was not a diplomatic communique and was not a threat assessment and was not any of the categories the Veth usually deployed for first contact correspondence. It was, by every metric Mira could apply, something the Veth had not done in all 11 previous first contacts. It was a question, just one, sent to David's personal comm, on his personal frequency with no fanfare and no ceremony. It asked, what was the color of the ship? He stared at the message for a long time. He replied, red, badly painted red. Near the nose it was uneven where someone had put too much on. The reply to the reply came in 40 minutes. The Veth, who deliberated in weeks and months, 40 minutes was the equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. It said, we would like to understand how this is possible. David read the message 3 times. Then he got up and made coffee and stood at the porthole and watched the stars and thought about Mira on her moon, with her flat water eyes and her 8 months of work and her voice with all the folds in it, and thought about a woman who had been taken apart and put back together mostly and had spent 15 years building toward a 90-second conversation with a 6-year-old boy. He thought about how thoroughly human that was, to take that much damage and still plant something. He typed back, I'll have to explain it in person. I'll need to bring someone with me who understands it better than I do. Give me the coordinates. The second meeting was larger. Mira came. She walked into the consultation chamber with the particular posture of someone who has gone into difficult rooms before and come out alive. And she looked at the council liaison, and the liaison looked at her. Really looked. In a way that was different from the flat scientific study of the first meeting. And something passed between them that David couldn't parse. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of it. What followed was not a negotiation and not a capitulation. It was closer to what happens when someone who has been very certain of some things encounters a single fact that doesn't fit the model. And they stop, and they really look at the fact. The Veth, for all their thousands of years of civilization, had never encountered a species that stored pain without function. They had never encountered a species that used emotional residue as a navigation system. Their entire taxonomy of other civilizations was built around the premise that intelligence, at scale, trends toward efficiency, toward the pruning of useless memory, toward clean architecture. Humanity, it turned out, was the exception that broke the taxonomy. To the Veth's credit, and this was what David had gambled on, what Mira had gambled on, what everything had been built toward. To their credit, when they found the exception, they did not discard it. They were scientists, genuinely. And the first rule of science, across every civilization the Veth had ever documented, was the same. When the data doesn't fit the model, you fix the model. It took 8 more months to move through the formal channels. There were committees and subcommittees and documentation requirements that Mira navigated with the patience of someone who had already paid every price there was to pay and was not interested in being stopped by paperwork. David flew his freight runs and paid his fine in installments, and listened to his sister's voice messages, and thought, sometimes, about the strangeness of things. He had not set out to be any particular kind of person. He had set out to be ordinary, which is the most honest ambition available. And it turned out that ordinary, the specific texture of ordinary, the accumulated weight of impractical memories, the toy ships and the voice messages and the decisions you make at the bottom of the spine, was the thing the universe needed someone to be. The formal recognition came through on a Tuesday, which was as undramatic as everything else about it. His comm chimed. He was eating a sandwich. He read the communique. Dry language, formal designations, the Veth phonemic equivalent of a handshake that had been deliberated over for 8 months, and he set it down and finished his sandwich. Then he sent a voice message to his sister. He told her he'd done something interesting. She would ask him, on the next message back, what he'd done, and he would tell her, and it would be a long message. He told her to take care of herself. He told her the usual things. He told her he'd be back on Calais Station in 3 weeks. Then he stood at the porthole and watched the stars. He had been out here long enough that the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full of something, the specific fullness of a place that contains more history than it shows, like a room where many important things have happened, a room that still holds the shape of all of them. Somewhere in this dark, Mira was on her moon, and the Veth were reconvening their council with a revised set of models that had one new category in them, a category that hadn't existed before, a category that translated approximately as the kind of mind that keeps what it doesn't need, and is therefore capable of becoming what it couldn't plan. David put his coffee cup down on the instrument panel. The amber light was off. The ship hummed its ordinary hum, carrying its ordinary cargo, out past the rim toward the next stop on the manifest. He thought about a toy ship, badly painted red, the roughness of the paint near the nose, the way it had felt in his hands for 30 seconds. In a market when he was 6 years old, he kept it. He would always keep it. All of it. All the useless accumulated weight of being a person who had lived and remembered and refused, in the deepest and most stubborn part of himself, to throw anything away. That was the thing they hadn't been able to model. That was the thing that had saved them. Mira had a habit, when she was thinking, of going very still. Not the Veth kind of still. Theirs was the stillness of calculation of everything directed inward towards some processing task. Hers was different. It was the stillness of a person holding something breakable in their hands. David had noticed it in the first hours on the moon, and he'd kept noticing it across the days of preparation. And he'd recognized it eventually as the posture of someone who had learned to inhabit the present moment very carefully because the past was too heavy and the future was uncertain. He asked her once in the third night, when they were both awake late and the gas giant was doing something magnificent above the horizon, throwing light in sheets across the cloud layer, a slow electrical storm inside a planet the size of small dreams. He asked her if she thought it would work. The whole argument, the whole gambit. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. I think the thing about the Veth, she said finally, is that they're genuinely trying to do something they consider good. They integrate civilizations because civilizations that are left alone tend to damage themselves. Their archive is full of species that would have destroyed themselves without intervention. They believe, correctly with good evidence, that they are saving more than they're erasing. That's not an answer. I know. She looked at the light on the horizon. The answer is, I don't know. I think they are capable of being surprised. I think they have never encountered a species that made the argument I'm asking you to make, because most species, when they're facing integration, send their most impressive representatives, their diplomats, their generals, their philosophers. They send the people who can demonstrate civilizational capacity. She paused. I'm sending you. A freight hauler, the most ordinary person I could find, who would actually read to the end of the message. David laughed. It surprised him. The genuine quality of it. The way it came out as a real laugh and not the uncomfortable kind you use to fill silence. Mira looked at him. And, for a moment, the flat water of her eyes had something moving under it. The Veth have 11 first contacts in their record, she said. In everyone, the species that was integrated sent their best. And their best were legible. Their best fit the VETH framework. Optimized, purposeful, clearly organized toward survival and development. The VETH looked at their best and thought, yes, this is what we expected. This confirms the model. She turned back to the horizon. You are going to walk in there, and you are not going to be their best. You're going to be exactly what you are, which is a man who keeps a useless memory of a cheap toy, who changes course because of a feeling in his spine, who listens to his sister's voice messages on repeat. You're going to be someone their model cannot account for. And that's the argument. That's the argument. She was quiet again. The argument is you. Just being what you actually are. She smiled, and the folds in her paper voice were audible even in silence. I've been building toward this for 8 months. Built charts, and data models and translation matrices, and I've prepared 17 contingency documents for 17 different scenarios. And in the end, it comes down to whether one ordinary human being can stand in a room full of the most thorough intelligence in this part of the galaxy and just not perform. Just be completely, unreservedly, impractically himself. No pressure, David said. Some pressure, she admitted. He did not tell her about the fear. There was no productive reason to mention it. The fear was there the whole time. Not the sharp animal kind, but the slower, more considered kind that comes from understanding the actual stakes. The kind that lives in your stomach and asks, periodically, if you are completely sure about this. He was not completely sure. He had not been completely sure about a single thing he'd done since he read to the end of that message. And he had done all of it anyway. That was, he supposed, a kind of answer in itself. The night before he filed the approach route, he sat in his freighter and listened to his sister's most recent message. She talked about her garden. There was a thing growing in it that she couldn't identify. She'd looked it up in 3 databases and gotten 3 different answers. And she'd decided she was just going to let it grow and see what it was. She talked about their mother's birthday coming up and whether David would be home for it, though she'd said it with the patience of someone who has long stopped expecting the answer she wants. She talked about the weather on Earth, which was apparently doing something unusual with the light this year, the angle of the sun in autumn, something about atmospheric conditions, and she described it for 2 full minutes. The quality of the light through the window in the mornings, the specific color of the sky at the edge of the day. David sat in the dark and listened to her describe the color of the sky for 2 minutes. Then he filed the approach route and set the timer and went to sleep. There were 47 other species represented in the VETH's primary hub when David arrived. He didn't know this in real time, Mira had told him, but he felt it in the way you feel the scale of a place even when you can't see all of it. The hub was not merely a VETH installation. It was the junction point for their entire network of relationships, their archive of civilizations, their ongoing project of order. The corridors had the quality of old libraries. Information everywhere, organized perfectly, and in that organization, a faint smell of something being held still. He tried not to think about that. He tried to think instead about the market, his mother's hand, the vegetables she was buying, the specific texture of the autumn light in the market. No, that was his sister's description from the voice message, but it fit, it worked, it was real to him anyway. The past and the present braided together the way they always were in human memory, not separated into clean folders but alive in each other, the way the past is always happening in the places where you carry it. That was the point. That was the whole point. He let himself feel the full weight of it as he walked through the VETH corridors, the whole accumulated impractical human pile of it. The ship, the market, his mother, his sister's voice, the color of the sky in autumn, every voice message, every freight run, every night at the porthole watching the stars and Mira's folded paper voice, and the flat water eyes, and the 90 seconds she had spent next to a 6-year-old boy in order to plant something that might, 37 years later, matter. He thought about insects drowning. Tell which ones were still alive, because they were the ones still struggling. The VETH had encountered 11 civilizations that stopped struggling when they were observed. They had documented the struggle and then watched it stop. Then they had integrated. David was still struggling. He would always be still struggling. Not against the Veth. That wasn't the right word. Struggling the way living things struggle. Against forgetting. Against the efficient discarding of what doesn't serve. Against the clean architecture of a well-optimized mind. Keeping the red ship. Keeping the color of the sky. Keeping everything. The liaison had a name that his translator rendered as 7 sounds and a silence. When she addressed him directly, after his presentation, after the 40 minutes of data, and the story about the market, after everything, she stood in the copper light with the alien stillness of her people, and she looked at him for a long time, and what she said was, "We have 11 records of first contact. In no record does a representative say, we are impractical. They say, we are powerful. They say, we are capable. They say, we are worth preserving. You said we are impractical. We keep things that do not function. We carry weight that does not help us carry weight." She paused, at this as though it were a strength. "It is a strength," David said. "It's the only strength that matters at the scale you're operating at." He kept his voice level. Not aggressive, just certain. "You've been integrating civilizations that optimize for survival, for legibility, for capacity. They send you the evidence of what they can do, and you integrate them anyway, because what they can do fits inside your model." He looked at her. "We can't give you that evidence. We're not optimized. We're not legible. We don't even know, on any given day, what we're capable of, because we're making decisions based on memories of toy ships and the color of morning light and the specific way our sister laughs." He paused. "That is the evidence. That we're still here, after everything, after every catastrophic self-interruption, every war, every time we broke the thing we built. That is the evidence. Not despite our irrationality, because of it." The silence went on long enough that he counted his own heartbeats. He got to 31. "The color of morning light," the liaison said, finally, very carefully, "is not the same everywhere." "No," David said. "It's not." He thought about his sister's window, the autumn angle of the sun. "Every place has its own. You carry yours. Always." Another silence. 23 heartbeats. "This is what you call memory," the liaison said. "Not a question. Person who is writing something down in a new category." "This is what we call being alive," David said. The copper light lay across the floor between them. The gas giant hung in the viewport, indifferent and enormous, older than anything in the room. David stood with his ordinary sore back, and his freight hauler's hands, and the badly painted red ship living permanently in the part of his mind that refused to prune, and he waited. The Veth were scientists. When the data didn't fit the model, you fixed the model. The liaison stood in her perfect stillness for a long time. Then she said, "We will need to discuss this further." And David thought, there it is then. He called Mira on the way back to the freighter. She answered on the second chime, which meant she'd been awake, which meant she'd been waiting. "They want to discuss further," he said. The silence lasted 4 seconds. For Mira, who had spent 15 years building toward this moment, 4 seconds was the equivalent of a very controlled exhale. "That's more than any previous first contact produced," she said. "No, David." Her voice had the paperfold quality, but there was something else in it now. Something newer. "You did well." "I just told the truth," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's what I mean." He piloted back through the quarantine corridors, with his hands steady and his stomach slowly unclenching, and his mind doing something it almost never did, which was to stop making the ranked list of stupid decisions and start thinking instead about what was next. About Calais Station. About his apartment and the chair shaped exactly right. About his sister's garden and the unidentified thing growing in it. He would go home, eventually. He would sit in the chair. He would listen to the voice messages. All of them. Even the ones he'd heard 100 times. He would carry everything, always. Because that was who he was, and he had stopped apologizing for it. Somewhere over the rim, somewhere in the amber light of an instrument panel, somewhere in the moment he'd read to the end of a message that any other person would have dismissed. The stars moved as the freighter turned, sliding sideways across the viewport, the way they always did. He watched them go. He thought, "I will always remember this, all of it." The mineral smell, and the copper light, and the stillness of her attention, and the weight of 37 years, and a toy ship that was badly painted red, and never mine, and always mine. He would keep it forever. That was the whole point.